Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Life Show. Happy Wednesday, everybody. We have a great show, in my humble opinion, on tap. 14 players who could sneak into the first round of 2025 fantasy drafts. Is it crazy to be talking about 2025 fantasy drafts in January? Yes. Is that going to stop us? No. And for that, we are excited. And by we, I mean myself, Ian Hartitz, as well as Fantasy Life's finest, Dwain McFarland and Chris Allen. The boys are back. Chris, how's it going, my friend?
I'm doing well. I mean, it's tough not seeing my Bengals in the playoffs, but now having a chance to focus on 2025, thinking about the personnel changes, the coaching changes, all the stuff that's ahead of us, kind of got them juices flowing, man. So let's get into it.
Dwain, I will be attending, Chris Allen's famous poker game this Saturday. I'm looking forward to it. Any tips from someone who I know has been in the poker streets much longer than I have?
Yeah, just don't talk, don't say anything, don't let people know. Oh, it's already blown. Like you're there to have fun, Ian. And then let's see how things go. So just play loose and fast. Just you be you, Ian. And if the poker part works out, great. If not, you're gonna have a good time getting to hang out with guys like Chris. I'm guessing that Drew's gonna be there. So you're gonna be swimming in some shark infested waters between Chris and Drew Davenport. So don't even know the other list, but there's quite a few good poker players in our fantasy community. Imagine that.
I think that's all you can say. Play fast, play loose, football and life as well. So gotta love that advice from The Rock himself. But with that, guys, let's go ahead and get into the show. Again, 14 players who can sneak into the first round of 2025 fantasy drafts. Let's get it. Want to give a shout out the Fantasy Crystal Ball today, presented by our friends over at DraftKings, where again we're looking at players who didn't quite crack my top 12 of my way too early mock draft, but are not too far behind. So, Dwain, let's finish things off with kind of again concluding where we got to yesterday with second-year stud wide receivers Malik, Nabers, and Brian Thomas Jr. Again, I would not fault anyone for just straight up having these guys in the top 12 because, well, they kind of already did it this year, Dwain.
Yeah, for sure. So like Brian Thomas Jr., we talked about A.J. Brown yesterday being at the bottom of round one. I do think he's the player that you're going to find fantasy drafters exchanging and moving down to round two to potentially take a guy like Brian Thomas Jr., Malik Nabers. And I think that the reasoning is fine. Ultimately, we've still got to see what other dominoes fall this offseason as far as the quarterback, offensive coordinator, different things like that could change for some of these teams. But you just have to remember, I get it. We've seen some wide receivers, including these two, perform even though they've had terrible quarterback situations. But we also saw other guys not be able to overcome that this year. So, I mean, I feel like our knee-jerk reaction is to say when something like this happens, look, see, told you quarterbacks don't even matter. If you're really good at football, that's all you need. And look, that's the number one thing. You got to be talented. These guys have clearly shown that. And the nice thing about them, though, Ian, is that, some of the guys in the past where we've seen the underlying data be there, like a Chris Olave, where we're like, guys, this guy's really going to be good in the future. Drake London, another name we'll talk about here. But they had never scored the fantasy points, right? They had the underlying target share, yards per route run, those things. The cool thing about these two guys is they've done all that, and the fantasy points have already come. So I get it. And if they somehow get an upgrade in their situation, I think that's where we really got to consider locking them into low-end round one. Otherwise, there is risk if these quarterback situations are terrible. We saw that play out this year for the Chicago Bears and all the guys that were involved there. You can go ask Rome Odunze how he's feeling. DJ Moore, how's that guy feeling? So we can't just sit here and act like quarterback play doesn't matter at all. Mostly, I just want to mention Caleb Williams one more time to trigger producer Matt Swing in the background.
BTJ, wide receiver 5 in total PPR points. Malik Nabers, wide receiver 6. So to Dwayne's point, yes, they already have been producing. That said, Chris, let's not act like Nabers was someone that we could just, again, put into our wide receiver 1 spot and have no issues with the entire year. I mean, from week 7 through 14, he didn't have a finish better than wide receiver 23. So, yes, the start was awesome. The finish was great. I'm not going to be the boy who cried, I'll take away all of his good games and he was actually bad. But there is a level here of, I guess, more volatility than you might expect from someone that would have, again, a more sure situation under center.
And I think that's fair to consider. And to both of your points, quarterback play is something that we do have to consider for most of these guys. Because when we're getting into the first round, we're nitpicking, right? Think about earlier this year when it was, oh yeah, we're going to be investing into the Cowboys offense with Dak, or is it going to be Tyreek Hill up at the top attached to Tua, Jamar Chase with Joe Burrow coming back from the injury? All of those guys had warts if you really tried to dive into it. And the same could be said for both Malik Nabers and Brian Thomas. But I would say, though, for both of them, if we just want to look at not the results, but the opportunity potential for both of them across each of the quarterbacks that Malik Nabers had to play with, around a 30% target share, 29% with Daniel Jones, 35% with a combination of Danny DeVito and Tim Boyle, and also over 30% with Drew Lock. Now, of course, those are in small sample sizes across the entire year, but if you can at least tell yourself a story about how a guy like Malik Nabers continues to be the wide receiver one for the Giants, the same thing for Brian Thomas with Jacksonville, and that's across both Mac Jones and also Trevor Lawrence, the games that he played with both those guys, over 20% target share with both of them. You can see how, at least from an opportunity standpoint, you would want to still consider them in the top 12, but of course, considering or looking at how the offensive line evolves for both the Giants and the Jaguars, how the quarterback play evolves for both of those squads. It's now what allows you to push them higher into the top 12 ranks, or at least keep them, let's say, in the middle tier of the wide receiver one ranks for 2025.
Dwayne, last thing I want to touch on with these guys, and just again staying on the topic of how a quarterback will impact the wide receivers, we do have catchable target rates in terms of your utilization score, all of our season stats. You guys can find all that on FantasyLife.com with a premium subscription. But looking at it from last year, I mean, both these guys were at 75 and 74% catchable target rates. That's pretty much the same as Mike Evans, Nico Collins, Rashad Bateman. Do you think there's a chance, Dwayne, that maybe we're overrating the quarterback impact? Because again, I understand there's a difference between Baker and Stroud and, the dog crap quarterbacks that these two guys had to play with. But when you are getting force fed these level of targets, maybe, even bad quote unquote professional quarterbacks still capable of getting the ball in the right zip code more times than not.
Well, I think it comes down to the scheme. Like if you look at the Giants, they were really willing to get Malik Nabers the ball in space underneath. I mean, most quarterbacks in the NFL can make those throws, so it's not going to impact that as much. Even one of the big games for Drew Lock at the end of the year, a lot of that was really just get the ball to Malik Nabers over there and let him just run and do everything else. And so it comes down to those sort of things. The problem is you're going to run into defenses that can take that away. And you talked about Malik Nabers in the middle of the year, and that's what happened. He was dealing with some injuries. It's also the fact that defenses just finally decided, we're just going to completely center in on this guy. You've got bad quarterback play. We're not going to give him all these easy catches. We're going to take away Malik Nabers as the first read on these design plays. And that really impacted his fantasy scoring. So I think we saw it play out both ways. Ultimately, what Drew Lock did, despite his flaws, he opened things up where at least the defense had to respect the rest of the field. And then that opened up big plays also later in the year for Malik Nabers where he could do his thing downfield. So as much as Mac Jones struggled, as far as, from a perspective of being a top NFL draft pick and hasn't lived up to expectations, he also kept pushing the ball down the field. And I think the thing that we saw from both guys, though, Ian, that is really good is they can win at all levels. You can just get them the ball quick, let them do something. You can get them the ball in the intermediate space. They can separate, slants, different things. They can beat man coverage, or they can get over the top of you. And anytime you have a wide receiver that can do all those things, if you match them up with a good schemer, they can overcome quarterback play. The problem is we don't always know. Are they going to get schemed correctly? Are those other things going to play out? There's just so many variables. But I will say the big thing to focus on is you have two players that can do it all. And typically, let's think about it. Like you're out in the wilderness, you got to survive. You want a Swiss Army knife. You want something that can do everything. You don't want just one blade. Like you want something that you can survive with, something that has a multi-purpose. And both of these guys, they're definitely multi-purpose weapons. They check all the boxes.
And accordingly, certainly going to be inside anyone's top 6 or worst case top 8 wide receivers. Again, just more of a question if you're going to be taking them over guys like Derrick Henry and Devon Achane maybe at that round 1 term. But let's talk about 2 more wide receivers who, again, very good players, but just kind of comes down to how high do we actually want to get them up in the ranks. But they are, again, clear-cut wide receiver ones. Of course, I'm talking about Ladd McConkey and Drake London. Chris, we're going to have, again, about 7 long months to hash this out. But as it stands right now, which one would you rather have on fantasy squads in 2025?
If I had to pick between the two, I would say Drake London is my preferred target between those two. At least if I'm looking at it from an offensive standpoint for at least the situations for both of them. Because for Ladd McConkey, the Chargers, it seems so clear as to what they need to work on over the offseason in order to really allow them to, one, get back to the playoffs, but also two, at least, let's say compete. I don't know if they're going to win a playoff game, but let's say compete, because the 190 plus receiving yards that McConkey had in that game, I mean, he wound up having one of the better games that we've seen from at least a rookie receiver, just receiver in general from a playoff standpoint. But he had 190. What was the next? QJ at 16? Something along those lines. Whereas if you can't have a passing core that allows all of your players to contribute, this is where you need to try and at least make some upgrades like over the offseason. And so if this is going to be a team that adds throughout the offseason, whether through the draft or free agency, that's where I can see a guy like McConkey not necessarily have him fall back into the wide receiver 2 ranks, but at least have his ceiling capped. Whereas with Drake London, with Michael Penix, 2-game sample, yes, I understand that, but still over 15 targets or around 15 targets per game with Michael Penix, you could see the connection start to go there. And also from a play calling and also play rate standpoint, the Falcons were turning into the team that we expected coming into the season, where it was more play action passing, more of the efficient throws that we were hoping to get out of a guy like Kirk Cousins. So if that connection continues to grow and they get a bit more in sync over the offseason, I can see a scenario where Drake London is the one that we would want to have over McConkey, but it really just comes down to what the team moves are going to be throughout the offseason.
It was a brief stint with London and Penix, but it was a very productive one. The wide receiver 3, again, during week 16 through 18 with the 8th overall pick under center. So, Dwayne, I kind of pushed back with the whole oh my gosh, Penix just unlocked London, because he was also the wide receiver 9 with Kirk Cousins under center during the first 15 weeks of the season. It's not like he was having a bad year. But, man, looking at that target share specifically the last 3 games, only Puka Nacua, A.J. Brown, and Brian Thomas Jr. were higher. So London is one of those guys, we had him right next to Garrett Wilson last year, and I kind of maintain the same state of mind, I guess, with both guys, where if they are finally given the chance to truly take over their offense with an above average quarterback, I mean, we are talking about wide receivers who could go from wide receiver 10 to maybe the wide receiver 1.
Yeah, look, Drake London's a super talented guy. We've known this for a long time, but this is really the first time when we've seen the fantasy points really flow. I mean, he averaged 23.1 per game over those last 3 games. You mentioned, the wide receiver 3 over that span with Michael Penix. And man, over that stretch, he had a 39% target share. So the one difference I see whenever you have Penix, and where I do think there is an argument for how he unlocked Drake London, is if you look at London, Ian, he is not like a burner. We talked about Brian Thomas Jr. We talked about Malik Nabers. They can unlock all 3 areas of the field. I'm not so sure that's London. I think London, he can beat you over the top, but really he's underneath and he's in the intermediate ranges of the field. And if you think back to some of the guys historically that have done that, like Brandon Marshall is a great example, you can still be a wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy, but you need a quarterback that has the mentality of you're not open, but you're still open. And I'm going to throw the ball to you. And I've got the arm strength to go ahead and try to make that work. And I'm just going to trust you to do it. And I think that is something that we haven't seen from Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins is much more of a, if you will, a finesse and an anticipation thrower, right? He is going to be reading, one side of the field. Typically he's watching his route combinations. He's got a high low or whatever. He's not going to be as likely to just say, I'm just going to Drake London, right, on this play. I do think there was a little bit more of that mentality with Michael Penix. Also could just finally be the realization that Kyle Pitts does suck. Why do we keep trying to get him the ball? And then honestly, Darnell Mooney battled some injuries down the end of at the end of the season too. So that's probably a little bit of a factor here. But man, bottom line is 39% target share gets you really excited. But as soon as you say that, and then you're talking about him versus McConkey, you look at the other side of the argument, and you look at Ladd McConkey from the time that he took over that full-time starting role, Ian, which I believe, going back, looking at the utilization tools, you guys can check this out over in the game log, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm just scrolling real quick. Yep, around week 7, turned into a full-time player, not just a guy that was on the field in the 3 wide receiver sets, now playing in 2 wide receiver sets and 3 wide receiver sets. He averaged 18.4 fantasy point per game from week 7 through the wild card game. So that's a big sample, man. And if you guys know, basically, if you score 16 and a half fantasy points per game, you're a wide receiver 1 in most given years in fantasy football going back to 2011. That's a long stretch for McConkey. So I am with Chris. Got to wait and see how some of these things play out. Do they go at a guy like T. Higgins in the offseason? But even if it does happen, I don't know. Oh, I forgot. I'm talking to the wrong person to talk about it. T. Higgins leaving away from the Bengals. Got the Cincy Storm Chaser here all riled up. But yeah, looking at Ladd McConkey, man, like still 26% target share. Like there's no one else on the team getting any targets. Like Quentin Johnson, like they tried, they forced it. He came through big in some games. Will Disley, Justin Herbert turned him into a little bit of something. But we've talked about this before with a quarterback like Justin Herbert. There's room for 2. Right? There's potentially even room for 3. So it would probably take the addition of 2 weapons for me to really want to bump Ladd McConkey down. I think he's locked into the wide receiver 2 conversation. And it wouldn't have surprised me, man, if he finished as a wide receiver 1. Again, another guy that sneakily, not on the same level as Brian Thomas Jr., Malik Nabers. You guys can all watch the film and you see it too. But he has more ability to get up over the top of a defense than what people give him credit for. He's not just a one-trick pony. He can attack multiple areas of the field.
Yak ability really has been just incredible to start his career as well. So yeah, I mean, look, he finished as a wide receiver 24 or better, 7 straight games to end the regular season. That was even before the aforementioned blow up in the wild card round. So I could see, Dwayne, when you get in the labs and you're making your projections, London certainly having a higher overall target ceiling under the assumption the Chargers are going to add a guy or 2. But at the same time, we certainly feel better about, Justin Herbert definitely being one of the league's better quarterbacks. Bad timing. I saw what happened last weekend, but just overall, guys, with the larger sample, I mean, we can be more confident in that versus Michael Penix, who, yes, made some really cool tight window throws. I put out some highlights the other day on Twitter. Like, I respect it. That said, he was the 6th worst quarterback in terms of completion percentage over expected, was a bit erratic again in between some of those flashes. So Chargers actually were the 7th most pass happy offense in terms of drop back rate over expected following their early season bye once Herbert was healthy. So Ladd McConkey, again, even if you do prefer London, not going to call you crazy for that or anything, is someone that, again, certainly deserves to be in that same conversation. So good stuff there, guys. Now let's get into some running back goodness right after a quick word to our friends over at DraftKings. Hey, football fans, there's only a few short weeks left in the season, and we've got some exciting divisional round games to look forward to now. Get in on the action right now with my partners at DraftKings Sportsbook. They're offering all new customers $200 in bonus bets instantly after betting just $5. Don't let this one slip away. Download the DraftKings app now and sign up using code FANTASYLIFE. The crown is yours. All right, fellas, running backs with some size concerns. Again, not quite cracking our early top 12, but also not too far behind. So I believe our first round running backs were Saquon Barkley, Bijan Robinson, Christian McCaffrey, and Derrick Henry. And that takes us to the next group of guys, Devon Achane, James Cook, and Bucky Irving. So, Dwayne, I know you've had some articles come out recently, talking about what Dwayne did right, what Dwayne did wrong during this past season. And one of the things that you did do right, so we applaud you, is kind of recognizing guys like Bucky, like Achane, and like Cook, maybe a difference of 5 or so pounds between them being over or under 200 isn't necessarily a reason to just full on fade the guy.
Yeah, I mean, and we hear this every offseason, especially over the last 3 to 4 years. We heard it with Kyron. We've heard it with Jahmyr Gibbs in the past. We've heard it definitely with Devon Achane. That was the big talking point around him. Obviously, Bucky Irving is going to fall into the same bucket. We'll talk about him some more later. So it'll be interesting to see what folks do with him next season, because it does become this polarizing thing in our community where there's a lot of people that'll say, hey, we're not worried about it. And then there's other people who are like, no, they just can't handle the full workload. We're not going to do it. They're not going to get the carries inside the 5. Has some really huge names. And look, we all get things wrong, but some people just claiming there's no way James Cook is going to get the carries inside the 5-yard line. Who got the carries inside the 5-yard line this year? It's James Cook. And what you guys have to realize, these are not this isn't your granddad's scat backs, right? Back in the day, whenever I was like young and playing fantasy football like you guys are today, like scat backs were guys that like you just got them the ball in space. You thought of them more as like this jitterbug, just got to avoid tackles. This is a different era. Like these guys came up through college, running between the tackles, using their acceleration, taking away angles, not afraid of contact. Can that occasionally lead to injuries for a smaller player? Yes. But you have to go back and look through history. Austin Eckler fits this archetype. Heck, CMC was pretty close to this archetype when he came out of college. Obviously, he's put on some pounds. Go back to Jamal Charles. Jamal Charles was not 200 pounds. These are guys that they're attacking the line of scrimmage the same way that bigger backs do. Obviously, they're using their skills to their advantage. They don't just want to take on all these direct hits. But there's multiple ways to win, and this style of running back can win in today's NFL. So I think the biggest thing you've got to do is you've got to take that argument and put it away. Now, it doesn't guarantee that they're going to get a full-time role. I will agree with this. If you've got a back that's 220 pounds that can do the things these guys do, they're much more of a lock to get the carries than a guy that's 195 that can do the things. It all really comes down to who's the complementary guy they have that they could share the time in the backfield with. Comes down to the offensive coordinator preference, a lot of different things. So I agree that being a little bit of a smaller back opens you up more to split carries because the coach wants to keep you healthy. But you can't assume that they're not going to get the carries inside the 5. All of these guys, man, got carries inside the 5. Achane got them. James Cook led his team in them. Bucky Irving did it, for the Bucks as well. So all of these players ended up really defying, what the reasons that people wanted to fade them and let them fall to like the late second round last year, sometimes the third round in fantasy drafts. So I think we just got to put it away. Like just real quick, and I'll stop and Chris will say his piece. But like Achane's a great example. Let's just use him. Ian, the guy that wasn't going to get more work the year before. Okay, he was at a 50% snap share, went up to 62%, up 12 percentage points. People were screaming, there's no way he even gets half the touches. Oh, yeah, like he blew it away. Attempts jumped 13 percentage points to 48%. Now, again, didn't get 70% of the workload, but he did get more than he got the season before. And I went back and looked at the games where it was him and Mostert together, right? I got rid of the games where Mostert wasn't healthy the year before. Route participation, up 17 percentage points. Targets, up 3 percentage points. Carries inside the 5-yard line, drum roll please, up 36 percentage points. 70% of the Dolphins carries inside the 5 went to Achane, the guy that would never get them because the year before, Raheem Mostert stole all those looks and scored all those touchdowns. So just realize, guys, when you see super talented backs like this that are in their prime, it's better to just bet on them. Even if they don't get the full-time role, they still have so many outs. So I like all the guys that you have mentioned here as far as being round 2 potential picks next season. And they all have runouts, man, where they could be in the top 3 running backs.
And especially with Achane, I mean, you saw just what he does as a receiver. No running back had more PPR points just from receiving. If he literally didn't have a single carry last year, he would have only finished 2.7 points behind Ramondre Stevenson, would have outscored Brian Robinson, outscored Travis Etienne. Again, just absolutely bonkers receiving usage. But I've also seen the pushback like, oh, look at Achane when Tua was hurt. I think that was more so Achane playing through a grade 3 high ankle sprain, guys. I mean, he averaged 3.3 yards per carry before his bye. He was right back up there 4.9 afterwards. So again, really wouldn't hold that too much against him. And he did wind up, toughing through it the whole year. Similar sentiment with Bucky Irving in terms of just playing every game, being a fantastic receiver, PFF's second highest grade, receiver in terms of their receiving grade usage. Obviously incredibly slippery between the tackles. Like Chris, they can do it all and we have no doubts about it because they just did it. James Cook is more of the interesting one because again, we've seen him catch those wheels down the sideline. Obviously he can do good things in the receiving game, but at the same time, man, we're talking about James Cook really having his receiving production crater from 2023 to 2024. But when you score 18 touchdowns, it doesn't really matter. So out of these 3, Chris, would Cook give you the most pause just because, again, we don't have that same kind of receiving assurance?
Polished, yes, because he does have that ability to work between the tackles that for Devon Achane, like while I think he has the talent to do it, it's just the state of the Miami's offensive line that might inhibit or prohibit like some of that rushing production that we would want. So let's see what Miami does over the offseason. I think they are kind of strapped for cash at this point. So how they make their changes to whether it's personnel, whether it's coaching or whatever, that might be what gets Achane back into the rushing column versus him acting as a receiver. The same thing for Bucky Irving. I would say that the Bucs offensive line is probably one of the better ones, but of course, once they get into inside the 5, there was that split earlier in the season between him and Rachaad White. But I do think that Irving showed enough that he should be able to get most of that workload in 2025. But across all of them, I agree with all of your points for between you and Dwayne about just being able to see past the traditional sense of you need to have that 250 215, 220-pound running back in order to do it all in the field. And for each of them, they all had the hallmarks or like the traits coming out of college that you should be able to see past them being able to be just running backs. Devon Achane coming out of Texas A&M around like a 15, 20% reception share. Same thing for Bucky Irving, 60% route rate coming out of Oregon. Each of these guys had the out of, if I'm not going to be able to make it as just a pure runner, being attached to a good offense, let's say, and also with a progressive play caller. So with Achane, he gets Mike McDaniel, Liam Cohen for Bucky Irving, Joe Brady for James Cook. All of those, in each of those cases, you do have the play callers that are able to see past the traditional, be able to use them for all of their skill sets, have them out there on the field in each of those scenarios. And that's where you're able to see them for our purposes here. In this game that we play for fantasy, you see how they can be used in each facet of the game that we would want to. So I can see a run out for all three of these guys, again, being in the, let's say, high-end RB2 conversation, or at least round 2 conversation for each of them, because of the way that they're used on the field, because of the fact that they can produce not just as runners on the interior, but also receivers as well.
I would say right now, James Cook feels the most risky to me, just because like his utilization actually went backwards, but his work inside the 5 went up. And that's what gave him like that big bump. And we just talked about how unpredictable carries inside the 5-yard line are. Like they could give him to Ray Davis next year. Like it could happen. Now, they might still just give him to James Cook. We shouldn't rule James Cook out because he's a smaller back. Ultimately, if you're taking James Cook, you're making a bet on the Bills' offense. The guy doesn't even get 50% of the snaps in the backfield. He's usually around 40 to 45%. He's getting 40, 45% of the carries. They are splitting things up 3 ways. They're intentionally putting Ty Johnson on the field for like 30% of snaps. He gets a lot of the passing down work. So, again, on the Bills, that can still work. Like if James Cook had that role on the Panthers, you would hate it. Like you would just absolutely hate life. So again, a lot of layers to the onion that you have to peel back. But I feel like right now, James Cook, the most risky. To Chris's point, obviously got to see how the rest of the postseason, not even postseason, the offseason, idiot. Come on, Dwayne. The offseason, the way the rest of that plays out to make some of these calls. Like Bucky Irving, we love right now. But man, if they took a round 2 running back, we'd be like, whoa, we would have to have a big break tap on Bucky Irving.
Or if Liam Cohen leaves or something like that. A lot of those situations can change in the next few months.
Okay, Liam Cohen, I get it. He's hitting the easy buttons and stuff. When Bucky Irving's catching a screen, reversing field, and breaking 4 tackles, like how does this all of a sudden come back to Liam Cohen? So I do, some of this play calling stuff, because the whole thing yesterday with Mike Vrabel, again, just being like, yeah, we don't want to throw the ball 50 times per game, and everyone and their mother trying to dunk on the guy, fake sharp this, fake sharp that. Meanwhile, Joe Brady and Ben Johnson are running the hell out of the ball, and they couldn't be getting more applauded for it. So really does seem to be more of a results-oriented, I think, discussion with some of these play callers. I think all these guys know quite a bit about football. Maybe give a little more credit to the players out there making it all happen. But just my 2 cents. Let's move on to 3 more running backs, guys, who again are kind of grouped together because there could be some incoming competition concerns. We're talking about Chase Brown, Alvin Kamara, and Breece Hall. So Dwayne, Chase Brown obviously won a lot of people their fantasy titles down the stretch. Not the best week 17, as we all remember, but we're still talking about the overall RB5 from weeks 9 through 17. After Zach Moss was out of the picture, I am old enough to remember when Brown was unfortunately stuck in that committee and just the RB28 during the first 2 months of the season. So, Dwayne, when you do look at Chase Brown, someone who has that explosive ability, but also maybe all too often uses it to run into the back of his own lineman, what is your confidence level on Brown keeping that job?
Yeah, look, the problem for Chase Brown, is those traits that he has, they didn't show up enough, in the box score. He ranked, 23rd in explosive rush rate, so the carries of 10 plus yards or more. With a guy with his speed, and home run ability, we would expect that to be higher. Now, he can still hit the big play at any time. That doesn't mean he doesn't have the speed, but he hasn't quite figured out how to maximize it. He was really average as far as his missed tackles force and all those things. But ultimately, and we've talked about this a lot, fantasy football comes down to volume, and they were willing to give him the volume. He was also taking over the backfield from Zach Moss guys before the injury ever occurred. We had a nice 4-week trend already happening. Not saying that Chase Brown would have gotten this workload that he finished the season with, which basically he just didn't leave the field, but he was already taking that backfield over. I do think, though, of all the guys, that we're talking about here versus the last group that we just mentioned, I think he's at pretty decent risk of them adding someone, whether it's through free agency, whether it's through the draft. And I do think he has enough questions in his game that it would cause me concern. And I would not be taking Chase Brown in round 2 of fantasy drafts if they draft another back in the first 3 rounds, maybe even 4th round, depending on who the name is. 4th round is really the new 3rd round in NFL drafts with how long people are waiting on running backs these days. So I would really need to see how the rest of that plays out. I would, if it's just bringing back Zach Moss, I would go into the season with an assumption that Chase Brown is going to lead the backfield, but I wouldn't go into the season assuming he's going to get an 80% snap share, which is really what it took to keep him up there in that high end, like top 3 running back status the rest of the way. So I think he was uber dependent on the volume. And again, that's really all we care about. But when we're trying to think about next year, I do think there's a lot of risk with Chase Brown.
Risk with Chase Brown, certainly, Chris. Risk with Kamara, getting up there a little bit. He's going to be 30 in July. Risk with Breece Hall, obviously not exactly turning in the sort of top 3 season that we're all hoping for. So, again, there could be new running backs added to the Jets, to the Saints. We're going to have new play callers who could perhaps lean on committees a bit more as well. That said, I think the one similarity we see with all 3 of these guys is if they get the chance to handle that workhorse role, we've seen them do it in return against some pretty gaudy fantasy heights.
100%. And I think for Chase Brown specifically, to Dwayne's point, is that in a couple of scenarios or situations that we would want our fantasy running back to be out there on the field, that's where Chase Brown was somewhat deficient. And I'm talking specifically about the short yardage situations. So in the weeks 7 through 17, like Chase Brown took over the majority of the work, Zach Moss out of the picture. Even after the trade for Khalil Herbert, we didn't see a ton of Herbert out there on the field as well. But still, 31 attempts for Chase Brown in short yardage, or just 3 yards or fewer in order to go, either goal to go or having to convert for another series. And he was just ahead of Najee Harris in terms of his conversion rate. And so if this is going to be a scenario where over the offseason, the Bengals, they want to, hopefully for my personal sanity, they want to try and revamp their defense. But also once they do get into those short yardage situations, it's not going to be the total reliance on Joe Burrow as a passer. And if it's going to be, they are going to lean towards their backfield in order to convert those series, is it going to be Chase Brown there out there on the field? Just depends on what type of investment they want to make over the offseason in order to change that. But the same thing could be said for Breece Hall. I mean, what is that offense going to look like as a whole? Who's going to be their quarterback? Who's going to be their play caller? So there's systemic risks you can associate with each of these guys, to the point where depending on what types of moves they make over the offseason, it can change how we feel about each of them. But I would say, at least for Breece Hall specifically, we do know at least the talent is there. It's just now how are we going to try and fit him or pin him into that offense that he's going to have to work around.
And out of all these guys we've talked about, again, they narrowly did miss the top 12, but I just think Alvin Kamara is probably going to be falling by the wayside again, Dwayne, but it's again going to be a situation where when he gets 20 plus touches in week 1, all of a sudden he's back in the position's top 5. So yes, the age cliff is coming. It's going to be a disastrous situation in New Orleans, but I don't know, in between some of the injuries really to everywhere on the offense, I mean, Derek Carr really wasn't playing that bad of football this past season. I've criticized the man for his fair share of hospital balls, but where are you with Kamara, Dwayne? Because when we talk about age not really mattering for Saquon and Derrick Henry because of their situations, I mean, 296 touches last year for Kamara, man, that's tough to beat.
Well, and we've also seen age for the archetype of back that's really that high-end producer in the passing game be able to kind of, extend that a little bit. Right. And we've definitely seen that from Kamara. This is the most prolific pass catcher that we have, over the last 10 years in fantasy football. Yeah, we've had some guys rival him on a here and there basis. McCaffrey's obviously right there in that conversation. Austin Eckler was in that conversation for a period. But if we look at really Kamara over that stretch, he has been the dude. Now, obviously, he's lost a little bit. We've got major systemic concerns with the Saints offense. We'll see what's going to happen with all of that. But to your point, Ian, he's probably going to fall too far in fantasy drafts. I would not be taking him in round 2, though. Whenever I'm taking these guys in round 2, I'm just trying to swing for a little bit more of a ceiling case, and I don't want quite as much risk as I think is what's going to come with Alvin Kamara. It will come down to who they add, right? If they don't make any additions in the backfield, and they did pay the guy again, so maybe they won't. I mean, we are going to have to think about, okay, what is the line that we would draw? So that's what I'm interested for you guys. This last year, there were a lot of folks that faded taking Derrick Henry in late round 2 or in round 3 of fantasy drafts. People faded taking Joe Mixon in round 3 of fantasy drafts. And all these things were mostly age and touch related. Kamara could really be in that same conversation. And it's okay, are we going to make that same mistake again? Now, I think you can say with the Ravens, A lot of upside there for touchdowns for Derrick Henry. With the Texans, we actually thought they were going to be a better offense than what they were. Made the playoffs. They're going to the divisional round, so congrats on that. But it hasn't been because the offense has just been like, running over people. So it's going to be interesting because there's issues here with Kamara as far as his team. I'm thinking he probably ends up more as like a round 4 pick. Once everything settles, it's going to be like, okay, probably going to get his volume, but man, we're concerned about the team. We're concerned about an age cliff hitting. There's going to be issues with Alvin Kamara.
Again, really a year of the workhorse running back in 2024. So not a given it's just going to repeat itself in 2025. As we know, things tend to change pretty quickly in the football world. But hey, would not be totally sleeping on Kamara. Again, keeping on. He's had a pretty freaking good career to this point. 3 more running backs, though, that I do think we probably will be ranking ahead of Kamara right after a quick word from our friends at Bud Light.
Even if you score, always stay hungry. No matter how hard you football, it's easy to Sunday.
Last 3 running backs really did have a nice, pass game floor to go along with all those touches they're getting on the ground. These next 3, not so much, but then again, 15 plus touchdowns firmly within their potential range of outcomes. I'm talking about Josh Jacobs, Kyren Williams, and Jonathan Taylor. And just gets to the point, Dwayne, where again, not that these guys can't catch the ball, particularly Josh Jacobs. We've seen him have multiple seasons in his career of 50 plus receptions, but thinking Marshawn Lloyd a bit more involved, in his second year, hopefully a bit better luck from those pesky old injury gods. And again, just a guy in the Packers offense that we appreciate. Same thing with the Rams and Kyren Williams, and a similar sentiment with Jonathan Taylor and the Colts, where he maybe has the most rushing volume, albeit we don't love their kind of offensive scoring upside. So again, we like these running backs. I don't think the profiles and the archetype we need to discuss a ton, but how are you going to kind of balance it this year, Dwayne, with these sort of players? Yes, we're looking at 300 plus touches. We're looking at likely double-digit touchdowns, but do they have the same sort of game-breaking ability as the Brian Thomas Jr.'s, the Malik Nabers of the world in round 2? Because again, this was a tough call. Not saying these guys are going to turn into 2025 Saquon Barkley's, but round 2 running backs versus round 2 wide receivers. Where are you kind of standing on it at the moment?
I think ultimately that's going to come down to after we really just play out like what the whole draft board is going to look like, because the way we're typically managing this is we're looking at the back end of drafts. We're looking at the middle rounds of drafts and seeing where do we think the most value lies. Are we going to think it lies at wide receiver? Is it going to lie at running back? We're not for sure yet. And depending on the style of fantasy football that you like to play, it can be different. In best ball, we know wide receivers are going to go early. In home leagues, wide receivers are what fell in drafts. So we really had 2 separate strategies for how you guys should be attacking those drafts. So those things are all going to have to continue to play out. The one thing I would want to say about these 3 guys, Ian, is, based on the studies that I've done, and I'm always digging deep into these things. And I'll tell you guys, a lot of the time, 95% of the time when you go down these rabbit holes, you find there's nothing. You spend like a whole day doing all this research, and Ian and I talk about building out these beautiful spreadsheets, and then you get to the end of it, you're like, if I squint really hard, maybe this matters, but there's nothing here screaming at me saying that we actually have something that's predictive one way or another. And that's what I want to tell you, like, with running backs, people love to talk about efficiency and all those things. And while you can go look at the top running backs every year, and typically they have those things going for them, we know that it can unlock that high end upside. But at the same time, the thing that's the most predictive year over year, and this is what's so hilarious, is actually just their volume from the year before. Now, there's a lot of context. It's like Zoe likes to tell me, Dad, use your context clues. She says I ask her stupid questions. Mostly I'm just trying to mess with her, because I want her to tell me to use my context clues. It's something I should already be able to figure out. But whenever you're looking at these guys, like Josh Jacobs, they paid him a lot of money. Marshawn Lloyd was a bust in year 1 due to injuries. Might he get a little bit more carries? Yeah, but they also might just not trust him again. And they already showed us they would trust Josh Jacobs. And Josh Jacobs historically has been a guy a player that multiple coaches have been willing to, trust, for a large workload. Kyren Williams, 2 years in a row now, or Sean McVay, even though he hasn't really earned it. Like, if we really look at Kyren Williams, he's not been that good. But the other thing I found in my study is really high efficiency numbers, the ones that running backs actually own. So they can tell us something about running backs, but they don't unlock more usage the next year. They also, for running backs that sucked in those areas, don't always guarantee they're going to get carries taken away from them. Again, context matters. Who are they going to add to the team? All these roster moves, still a lot to be seen. But historically, previous year volume is the best predictor of fantasy points the next year for these running backs. And these are all guys that had their workload locked down. Another one we talked about just recently was Chuba Hubbard. Like, we kind of skipped over him. Obviously we've got Jonathan Brooks, unfortunately, suffering another ACL injury. So are they going to spend draft capital again on a running back? Or are they going to let, Jonathan Brooks take another year to heal again? If so, Chuba Hubbard kind of fits this same conversation. So we'll come down to who these teams add. But, man, there's something about coaches, Ian, and there's something about the traits they're looking for that just say, I trust this guy. I want him on the field. They may not be flashy. They may not break all the long runs. But guess what? A lot of times these coaches don't care. And, honestly, there's not that many backs in the league that can really handle a huge workload and give you those traits. Like Saquon Barkley's, those are pretty rare.
Yeah. He has that, again, ability just to rip off the 80-yard touchdowns. Not too many guys out there like it. Jonathan Taylor can be one of them, though, and we did kind of start to see that towards the end of the year. Currently has an NFL-high 5-game streak with over 100 total yards. And I do wonder, Chris, if Jonathan Taylor almost has that similar Saquon quality from 2023, when we remember Saquon had that early season high ankle sprain and just didn't really look like the same version of himself with the New York Football Giants. Meanwhile, this last year, man, JT, again, grade 3 high ankle sprain at the end of September, all of a sudden starts looking like his former self by the end of December. So do you think there could be a bit of a JT bounce back or Anthony Richardson experience, and just, again, the lack of a receiving floor maybe scaring you off?
That's scaring me off, but not to the point where I'm going to completely devalue him. But he is somebody that I would say deprioritize, like towards, depending on where he's at in the draft. Because over that back end of the 2024 season, I mean, the Colts, they were 24th in rushing success rate, 23rd in red zone plays per game, and because of Anthony Richardson's struggles as a passer and the rest of the offense not really getting there, it really took those Herculean type efforts from Jonathan Taylor down the stretch of him posting how many games of 100 yards and a touchdown did he have, or 100 yards in the touchdown, or at least 100 yards, or something along those lines. It was like 4 or 5 games in a row. So that's where I do have some general concerns about Jonathan Taylor. It's not necessarily a talent thing. It's more about the rest of the guys around him. Because, he was getting 23 touches per game over that stretch. And still, unless he was getting over 100 yards, unless the results were there, it really was going to be problematic to have him as your RB1. So I'm looking more to guys like Kyren, who are a part of, let's say, more efficient offenses. Because at least for the LA Rams, yes, they do have some down games here and there, but we know that a play caller with Sean McVay is able to get most of his guys in scoring position more often than not. So out of that grouping, I do see Kyren as the guy that I would probably look more towards, because even if Kyren had put the ball on the ground 3-4 times just in the wild card round alone, and it didn't matter for a guy like Sean McVay. He still trusts his guys. So to Dwayne's point, if he has the trust of the coaches, and if he's still getting that type of workload and also attached to a good offense, I think those at least give you the traits, or at least the checks most of the boxes that you'd want to continue to target them in drafts in 2025.
What's real interesting, is just Jacobs and Kyren definitely are on the better teams. And look, all these guys check the volume box we talked about. Coaches trust them. So I think we feel pretty good about their roles next year, assuming something bad doesn't happen as far as adding another player. But I will say this, if there's one of these guys in this group that could break fantasy football next year, and we're like, whoa, that was the running back 1 overall, it's Jonathan Taylor. Undoubtedly. And it's because of what you saw at the end of the year. Those other 2 guys just can't, they're not going to do that. Like, Jonathan Taylor does have that rare ability to just take a game over as a running back, similar to Saquon Barkley. And I think that's the thing that when I look at it, I'm like, which one of these guys is the most like Saquon? It's easily Jonathan Taylor, and it's not really close. So it really comes down to, what are you trying to do? So it's like, I'm not disagreeing with Chris. I think that, the steadier performers might be Jacobs and Kyren Williams. But if I'm thinking, man, I'm just going to mess around here, and in the middle of round 2, maybe take the guy that could finish as running back 1 overall, and it could be a runaway, I still think it's Jonathan Taylor. Yeah.
I do wonder if there's something, because I agree overall with these, running back efficiency stats, we probably overweight them. I wonder if that explosive ability is the one we should be trying to hang our hat on more than not, because that is what's separating guys like Saquon and Henry, the ability to get those 50-plus yard house calls. How predictive is it? Well, we got, a lot of offseason time to help try to figure that out. So feeling good about, again, these running backs as staples in round 2. However, our next topic isn't exactly guaranteed to be there. Maybe he'll be higher, maybe he'll be lower. lower, but it's going to depend a lot on the landing spot. That's right. We're talking about incoming rookie RB from Boise State, Ashton Jeanty. Obviously had an absolutely marvelous 2024 campaign. A lot of people thought he should have won the Heisman over Travis Hunter. And Dwayne, just again, kind of looking at some of the teams that do need running backs, there are a lot of situations here that could work out, very, very well for him. So right now the Steelers don't have a running back under contract ahead of 2025 or a quarterback, bold strategy there, Cotton. But we also have 5 other teams with under $5 million devoted to the position. Browns, I wouldn't love that. Vikings, Broncos, Cowboys, though, I think we can agree those would be sweet. The Chargers and Raiders aren't too far behind. Obviously, we prefer the Chargers. But with Jeanty, Dwayne, he is someone who I'm sure is going to be pretty high in the super model because, again, bonkers rushing numbers, but also 80 catches for 822 yards in his 3 years at Boise. I mean, don't want to call anyone necessarily a can't-miss prospect, but I'd be shocked, man, if he isn't clearing Jonathan Brooks and, up there with some of the better prospects we've seen in recent memory.
Yeah, I'm super excited to plug him in. Right now, I'm in the phase of going back and reworking through the model, making sure we got things weighted right. I haven't brought the new prospects into the model yet, so it's kind of like I'm slowly working my way there. And like Ashton Jeanty, is the he's the big gift under the tree that you're looking at. Getting ready for Christmas. You're like, man, what's in that box? What did Mom get me? And that's the way I feel about Jeanty right now. But here's what I'll say. I think there's kind of 3 scenarios here for Ashton Jeanty, right? One, which would be one we don't want. He lands on a team that already has a stud just because he slips a little too far in the draft, and somebody's like, we don't care. He's a good player, like Brock Bowers last year. They already had Michael Mayer, but they're just like, we want another good player. That could happen. He could land on a team he could be stuck behind a guy like Jonathan Taylor, right? He could be stuck playing with a guy like Kyron Williams. That's the first scenario. If that happens, if he lands with another team that's got a proven producer in front of him, he's going to be more of a round 6, round 7 pick. People are going to still be wanting to bet on Ashton Jeanty, but they'll be a little bit more tempered. And, people will be in or out. You're going to have to kind of use some rose-colored glasses to see how that's going to work out. Then you got the next scenario where and maybe Kyron's more in this bucket. He lands on a team that has an established starter, but at the same time, we're like, man, he can probably push that person aside. And maybe Kyron fits that. Jonathan Taylor, we would be like, ooh, wow, he's probably going to have to play a backup role at first. But when you look at a guy like Kyron, we're probably looking at, okay, he could really force a 50-50 split. And in that scenario, it really would come down, does he land on a good team or does he land on a bad team where we think it's going to be more of a split? And then there's the final scenario where he just lands on a team where he's going to, we see right away, he's going to be the clear-cut one. Cowboys are a great example of that, Ian. If that happens, this guy's going to end up being a low-end running back 1 or high-end running back 2 pick. The only thing is making me not say he's a lock to be a running back 1 pick is how well all of these young receivers played last year with Malik Nabers and Brian Thomas Jr., all these guys we've been talking about. So you already have these really young, new, shiny toys that have already proven themselves. So I don't know. He might not make it into round 1. I'll tell you right now, in best ball, in the streets where people get really aggressive with this stuff, I think he'll just be a round 1 pick right away. Home leagues, maybe an early round 2, middle round 2 pick. There'll be a little bit more, things will be a little bit more tempered there, but a first 2 round pick for sure for Ashton Jeanty if he lands on a team like the Cowboys.
And that's where it's wild, Chris, because I don't disagree with the idea that Jeanty could be an immediate top 5 running back, but it's like that Family Guy meme. It could be anything. It could be a boat. He could be Jonathan Taylor, but why not just take Jonathan Taylor?
Well, because we just watched him run for over 2,200 yards in a single season. Now I get that it's in college, but now if he winds up on a team that needs a running back right now, whether it's the Cowboys or I'll toss out the Broncos, who were towards the back end of the league in terms of rushing success rate, rushing yards per game, he could probably fill a hole that could really boost the offense like Denver's. I can see a scenario where we start to push him more into the upper echelon of the running back ranks, because as you start to think about how that offense could perform more, how much volume he can get, which we all agree is going to be one of the key factors in terms of evaluating these guys from a fantasy standpoint, that's where we can start to see a scenario where Jeanty's now getting most of the carries. He's now on a team that's going to be devoid of talent behind him, and now he's going to be the guy that's going to be getting the carries inside the 5, going to have the receiving options as well. So if he has that, already comes into the league with that complete package, seeing him on a team that's going to require all of him, from every skill set that he has, is going to want us to push him up more and more in drafts.
Don't think this will be the last time we're talking about Mr. Genty this offseason, and looking forward to, again, getting a lot more NFL draft stuff from our friend Thor on this show as the offseason progresses as well. Fellas, let's close things out, though, with a look at the tight end position, specifically two guys who could be knocking on that round one door. Cardinals, Trey McBride, and the Raiders' electric rookie, Brock Bowers, obviously will be entering year two here in 2025. So, Dwayne, I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. You know, two of the top three tight ends in PPR points per game last year alongside George Kittle. The question is, do you think the ceilings here are high enough to warrant taking these tight ends again in round two? Because let's face it, man, like, you are paying a bit of an opportunity cost there.
Yeah, you are, but at the same time, if you get it right, and they really are, like, they stand head and shoulders above all the other tight ends who, you know, struggle in a season, it's a massive advantage for your fantasy team. So, I mean, there is a strategy side to this thing, and I think overall, like, the easiest way to look at it, like, and just to kind of simplify it, is if we put them in with the wide receivers, and we've got wide receivers and tight ends all together. I mean, Brock Bowers would have finished as the wide receiver 18. You know, or the 18th player with 15.5 fantasy points per game. And you've got Trey McBride just slightly ahead of him. He would have finished 17th. George Kittle would have finished 15th. So you got to start thinking about it in those terms. Like, you see it on your screen. I mean, it's kind of crazy still when I look at it. 112 catches for Brock Bowers. In any year of any career for any tight end, 112 catches is insane. He did it as a freaking rookie. Trey McBride, 111 catches only in his third season. So these are young guys that are still ascending in their game. Man, I think they're late round two, early round three picks. Like, you can't take them over the receivers that could go off for 1,800 yards because they don't have that most likely in their bag. Okay, so like Brian Thomas Jr., Malik Nabers, these guys that we've told you could win at all levels. I think if you're comparing these guys to other wide receivers, you've got to compare them to that range that can work the intermediate and underneath areas of the field. They don't necessarily have the consistent ability to also beat you over the top. So if you start thinking about that, take away tight end and wide receiver from the name, just think about what they can go out and do on the field. These would kind of be guys that could be just those massive possession receivers. So more like a Drake London. Like, these guys can rival Drake London. So if you're willing to take Drake London in the middle of round two, I think you should be willing to take Brock Bowers and Trey McBride in the middle of round two. So I think that's where these guys end up falling into in drafts, middle of round two to middle of round three. And honestly, I get it. Sam Laporta burned everybody last year, so I think that will be the one thing that's going to give some people pause. But I do really believe that these are generational talents at the tight end position. I just think they've shown enough that we really shouldn't doubt it. As good as Sam Laporta was, these guys were way better than what Sam Laporta was, even as a great rookie.
Chris, there's been some speculation that Ben Johnson could actually be looking at the Raiders, and boy, is that going to present some fun, talking opportunities. Because on the one hand, we're going to get look what just happened to Sam Laporta. Now you want to use that early round pick on Brock Bowers, but the other side of things is going to be, oh my gosh, Brock Bowers in the Amon-Ra St. Brown role. So, any early thoughts on that, Chris?
I mean, I can't even imagine what he would be like in the Amon-Ra St. Brown role. But to Dwayne's point earlier, it's that I would say that
really he's already playing it, guys.
Well, he kind of is. Yeah, now that I think about it, his slot role and the amount of targets that he's getting, he is kind of playing it already. But to Dwayne's point earlier is about how much the opportunity cost of the other receivers that are going to be drafted similar to the amount of opportunity those two tight ends are going to get. Because think about it. 25, 26, 27% target share across both Trey McBride and Brock Bowers, about let's say 30-ish%, just below 25, 30% targets per route run. I mean, there are like 5 or 6, 7 wide receivers I can name that probably fit inside that mold. You've got I think Drake London, Dwayne mentioned earlier, but Nico Collins, Juwan Jennings, Mike Evans, Zay Flowers, Chris Godwin, even Amon-Ra St. Brown. I mean, those are the types of receivers that we're getting those same level of opportunity across, in their relative offenses. And if I can name 6, 7 wide receivers that kind of fit that mold, and really there are only two tight ends that are kind of sitting there as well, that's where you can see the tier drop off. That's where you would want to invest in those types of guys, because if I can get that type of opportunity elsewhere, I can maybe layer in and get that advantage at the tight end position there and try and pick up a Juwan Jennings later. Nico Collins, probably not. Chris Godwin, potentially coming off the injury. But you can see where playing that type of strategy where you can get that type of volume at the wide receiver position elsewhere allows you to get that advantage at tight end and wind up having to be able to beat the beat the rest of your league mates over the head with a guy like Brock Bowers, with a guy like Trey McBride. And for the case of Sam Laporta, I think we all talked about this last offseason where the touchdown dependency, quote unquote, like for Sam Laporta was at least one of those yellow flags. I wouldn't say red flags, but one of those things where, yes, if he were to step back a little bit from a touchdown standpoint, that's where we could see a guy like Sam Laporta start to fall off. Whereas we know that's definitely not the case with Trey McBride because it took him how many weeks in order to get into the end zone as a receiver? So it's
he's got to go the other way.
Yeah, he has to go the other way. So if he winds up doing the Sam Laporta in year one thing, now we really have an advantage at the tight end position. So for both of them, I'm looking at how much volume those guys are getting relative to the wide receivers in the same range. And if I can rattle off 6-7 guys that might get the same amount of volume on a week-to-week standpoint, I'll try and at least look at those tight ends versus the wide receivers. Or in fact, if I'm drafting at the turn, I can get them both.
I'm ready to draft. Let's do it, guys. Who needs any more off-season work? I'm ready. Let's get it. But appreciate you guys again checking out our way too early look at, again, the first and second rounds ahead of 2025. Much more on this throughout the rest of the offseason, obviously, but also much more about, again, it's still exciting divisional round state. There is still football going on after all. Make sure you guys check out our Thursday and Friday shows for more goodness on that. So for Dwayne, for Chris, for producer Matt, for producer Kelsey, I'm Ian. Thanks again for tuning into the Fantasy Life Show. And until next time, take care, everybody.